Oil blockade is a phrase that sounds like old empire, but what is happening off Venezuela right now is a modern technique of pressure. You do not have to invade a country to make it feel invaded. You just make its cash pipeline unreliable. In the last days, US forces led by the Coast Guard moved to interdict and seize another sanctioned merchant vessel in international waters off Venezuela's coast, and American officials describe this as the second seizure of this kind in recent weeks. The timing not accidental. Days earlier, President Trump publicly ordered what he called a total and complete blockade of all sanctioned oil tankers entering or leaving Venezuela. And the enforcement signal was the point as much as the seizure itself. The first seizure earlier this month shows how concrete this has become. Court records around that operation indicate US authorities executed a judge-signed seizure warrant issued in late November and close to expiring when the boarding happened. Outside maritime risk analysts linked that case to the very large crude carrier MT Skipper, which had reportedly loaded about 1.8 million barrels of Venezuela's heavy Merey crude at the Jose export hub before sailing. US sanctions had targeted that vessel over allegations tied to Iranian oil trading from a previous identity, and the broader sanctions regime on Venezuela's oil sector dates back to 2019. If you want one clean mental model, imagine a toll bridge on a busy trade route. You do not need to burn the city across the river. You put checkpoint on the bridge and start impounding the trucks you decide are contraband. After first impoundment, the bridge itself becomes expensive. Some drivers turn around, some pay extra, some reroute, and some take illegal dirt road that breaks axles and requires bribes. And the city across the river feels the squeeze without a single bomb falling. Using Coast Guard is also part of story, because it lets Washington speak language of warrants and sanctions compliance instead of open warfare, even if military support sits behind the curtain. Interdiction in international waters is careful legal and political choice. You avoid crossing Venezuelan territorial lines, but you still turn sea lanes into pressure valve that Washington can tighten or loosen at will. This is why the administration keeps public details vague: names, exact coordinates, the cargo, because ambiguity itself is weapon. It forces every captain and every insurer in that network to assume they could be next. Once that fear spreads, effect becomes bigger than single ship you tow away, because it rewrites risk calculus for whole trade, and in shipping, perception is price. And notice the wording. This is not a classical naval blockade of whole Venezuela. It is blockade of sanctioned tankers, meaning target is the shadow infrastructure that keeps oil moving when paperwork says it should not. That difference matters because it signals selectivity. Washington can say, "We are not starving country, we are enforcing our sanctions," while Caracas can say, "This is piracy aimed at our sovereignty." And both narratives can coexist. President Nicolás Maduro has framed these moves as an attempt to overthrow him and seize Venezuela's oil wealth. And from his perspective, every helicopter rope on a tanker deck looks like regime change rehearsal. For Trump, domestic framing is different. Pressure without new American casualties, show of control, and message that sanctions not just ink on paper, but physical barrier in the water. Strategic logic simple. Venezuela's government runs on oil rent, so you squeeze the oil rent and you squeeze the state. And you do it in a way that can be reversed later if you want bargaining leverage. A blockade that can be switched on and off is like dimmer switch in a room. It lets you punish, then offer relief, then punish again, all while insisting you are merely enforcing rules you already announced. So even before we talk about barrels and prices, understand the signal. Washington trying to turn Caribbean approaches to Venezuela into controlled gate. And once gate exists, side holding key sets the terms. In other words, this is sanctions policy graduating from spreadsheets to ships. And moment that happens, every economic argument becomes security argument, because rules now enforced by force. Now here is part many people miss. Venezuela's oil trade has been living in gray zone habits for years, because US energy sanctions have been in place since 2019, and the country survived by discounting crude and leaning on improvised logistics. The trade relies on what people call shadow fleet, ships that change flags, shuffle ownership through shell companies, and sometimes obscure tracking signals so cargo story becomes difficult to prove. Recent monitoring of area has described more than 70 tankers operating in or near Venezuelan waters in a single week, with at least several dozen already designated under US sanctions, and a notable number sitting loaded with crude or fuel and simply not leaving. That image, loaded ships waiting like floating warehouses, tells you deterrence working, because the most dangerous moment is transition from inside Venezuela to out on the route, where seizure becomes possible. Economic mechanism is ruthless. Moment you introduce credible chance of interdiction, insurers raise premiums, banks hesitate to finance cargoes, ship owners demand higher rates, and buyers demand deeper discounts. So Venezuela earns less even on barrels that still move. This is why you see market reaction in spreads and delays before you see it in official statistics. Because shadow system runs on trust and speed, and seizures attack both. At same time, Washington not closing every door. Certain authorized flows can continue on approved vessels, which creates split system, legal lanes for few, high-risk lanes for many. And that split transfers leverage away from Caracas and toward whoever controls licenses, compliance rules, and enforcement tempo. China remains largest buyer of Venezuelan crude, with December shipments reportedly running at well over 600,000 barrels a day. And key point is not that China cannot replace those barrels in absolute volume, but that discounted sanctioned crude became tool in competitive game of refining margins. If interdictions and waiting ships reduce effective supply long enough, prices do not need to explode to matter. Even persistent risk premium raises transport costs, complicates inflation politics, and punishes consumers far from Caracas, including in Europe, where energy sensitivity is still high. Now add security shadow behind legal language. US officials describe significant military buildup supporting these operations, with multiple warships positioned in region and high-end assets nearby. An administration has publicly hinted that maritime actions could be followed by broader operations, including on land. Officials also point to wider campaign of strikes and interdictions against vessels accused of narcotics trafficking in same maritime neighborhood, which creates combustible mix of missions, oil sanctions enforcement, counter-narcotics, political pressure, all sharing same sea space. When you combine law enforcement posture with military backstop, you create ambiguity that can be stabilizing because it deters, or destabilizing because one bad radio call or one nervous captain can trigger incident that politicians then feel forced to escalate rather than admit mistake. Reports around current operation also describe scale of sanctioned inventory. Of those 70-plus tankers, roughly 3 dozen already sanctioned, and more than a dozen reportedly loaded, meaning policy now aimed at visible queue of potential targets. Administration paired this with heavy rhetoric, calling Venezuelan leadership hostile regime and using terrorism-style labels, while Caracas rejects threats as illegitimate and says Washington after control of its vast oil reserves. Markets react to rhetoric because rhetoric tells you how politically costly it will be for either side to back down. Even a 1% move in crude on announcement day is not about today's barrels. It is about tomorrow's risk. And do not forget network effect. Many of these ships are not only Venezuela ships. They are same kind of vessels used in sanctioned trades involving Iran or Russia, which means every enforcement action teaches entire sanctions evading ecosystem how to adapt. So you get cat and mouse game, where Washington tries to make cat big enough that mouse stops running. And mouse responds by becoming more opaque, more state-protected, and sometimes more reckless. This is why key weapon here not just boarding team, it is uncertainty. Because uncertainty is what makes commercial network freeze itself. So question is not, can United States cause pain? Because it obviously can. And it is doing it with method that avoids political costs of ground war. Real question is, what is end state and what price paid on way there? If goal is regime change, history unforgiving. Blockades and sanctions often hit ordinary people first, and leaders survive by tightening repression and letting black market become political instrument. So country becomes poorer and harder, not freer. If goal is negotiations, you need off-ramp that does not look like surrender for either side, because pressure without credible bargain is just pressure that drifts toward escalation. Ripple spreads beyond Venezuela quickly. Neighbors watch and adjust posture. Colombia, because borders and smuggling routes react to pressure. Guyana, because offshore energy and territorial nerves make neighborhood jumpy. And smaller Caribbean states, because heavy naval traffic and more inspections can disrupt shipping lanes that keep their economies alive. Cuba matters too, because any disruption in Venezuelan energy flows can turn into collateral pressure on Havana, whether intended or not. Europe not immune either. Even if it buys little Venezuelan oil directly, it lives inside same global price system, and energy shocks return as social friction and political polarization faster than people admit. If you want to know whether this becomes sustained embargo or short burst of theater, watch three things, because speeches lie and logistics do not. Watch how many loaded sanctioned tankers dare to leave Venezuelan waters. Watch discount Venezuela forced to offer compared to global benchmarks, and watch insurance and financing signals. Because once underwriters treat route like war zone, the trade collapses without single new law. My judgment is that what we watch is strategic coercion dressed as policing, and it is effective in short term precisely because it weaponizes uncertainty. But toughest question, one people avoid because it makes everyone uncomfortable, is what precedent being written here. If one great power can physically seize commercial vessels in name of its sanctions regime, what happens when another great power copies same playbook against ships it dislikes, and world discovers the toll bridge has more than one gatekeeper?